They say blood is thicker than water. It's a lie they tell you to keep families together, a comforting phrase whispered over holiday dinners and in hospital waiting rooms. But I learned the truth in the cold glare of flashing blue and red lights, with the taste of betrayal as bitter as bile in my throat. Blood isn't thicker than water, it's just easier to stain. It can be used to paint a picture of guilt on an innocent man, to wash away the sins of the favored child, and to drown a son who was already struggling to keep his head above the surface. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of how my family handed me a shovel and asked me to dig my own grave. But they made one fatal mistake: they taught me how to use it. It all began, as most tragedies in our family did, at the Sunday dinner table. The house I grew up in, a sturdy two-story colonial in the quiet, suffocating town of Oak Haven, Ohio, always felt more like a museum than a home. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph on the wall was a testament to the legacy of Robert Hayes, my father. His presence filled every room, even when he wasn't there. He was a man built from the same hard oak and cold steel he used in his construction business, a man who saw the world in blueprints and bottom lines. In his grand design, there were successes and there were failures. His daughter Chloe was his masterpiece. I was the foundation crack he was constantly trying to plaster over. That particular Sunday was no different. The air was thick with the scent of roast beef and the unspoken tension that was our family's most consistent guest. I had arrived with a rare flicker of hope in my chest. After 3 years of grinding work at the Oak Haven lumber mill, working my way up from sweeping floors to operating the heavy machinery, I had finally been promoted to shift supervisor. It wasn't a corner office on Wall Street, but for me, it was everything. It was proof. Proof that the boy who had stumbled through his late teens in a haze of addiction was gone. Proof that I was capable, responsible, and worthy. I just needed him to see it. I waited for a lull in the conversation, my fork feeling unnaturally heavy in my hand. My mother, a pale, quiet woman who had long ago learned that silence was the safest currency in this house, was carefully arranging her green beans into a perfect line. Chloe, my younger sister by 6 years, was glowing. She was in her final year of medical school, the golden child destined to fulfill every dream my father had for his name. I cleared my throat. "So, I have some news," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. My father, Robert, didn't look up from his plate. He was meticulously carving a slice of beef, the motion precise and unforgiving. He asked what it was, his tone suggesting he was merely pausing between bites. "I got the promotion," I said a little louder this time. "The shift supervisor position at the mill. It's a big step up. More responsibility, better pay." For a moment, there was only the sound of his knife scraping against the porcelain plate. He finally looked at me, his eyes a cold, dismissive gray. He told me that was nice. Then he turned his full beaming attention to Chloe. He asked her how her clinical rotations were going, his voice booming with a pride he never once directed at me. Chloe launched into a detailed story about a challenging diagnosis she had helped a senior doctor with. My father listened, captivated, nodding, asking follow-up questions. He told her she had a brilliant mind, that she was going to be a credit to the Hayes name. He said he was proud of her. That word proud hung in the air between us, a shimmering prize I could see but never touch. My own news, my own hard-won victory, shriveled and died on the table. It felt foolish, insignificant. A lumber mill supervisor versus a future doctor. In my father's ledger, it wasn't even a contest. I looked at Chloe, hoping for a flicker of support, a small smile, anything. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just kept talking to our father, her face animated, basking in his approval. I saw it then, the familiar, uncomfortable guilt in the way she held her shoulders. She knew it was unfair, but she would never challenge him. His love was a conditional gift, and she was terrified of ever having it revoked. The rest of the dinner was a blur of quiet agony. My father continued to ignore me, occasionally directing a pointed comment my way disguised as fatherly advice. He asked if I was sure I could handle the pressure of the new job, reminding me that I hadn't always been reliable. Each word was a subtle twist of the knife, a reminder of the past I was fighting so hard to escape. He wasn't just my father. He was my parole officer, my judge, and my jury, and I was serving a life sentence for the crime of being a disappointment. I excused myself as soon as I could, the uneaten food on my plate a symbol of my rejected offering. I retreated to my old bedroom, a space that still felt like it belonged to a troubled teenager. Posters were long gone, but the ghost of my failures lingered in the air. I walked over to the mini-fridge in the corner, a relic from my college days, and pulled out a can of beer. I wasn't supposed to drink. It wasn't part of my recovery plan. But tonight, the silence in my head was too loud. I needed to muffle it just for a little while. One beer wasn't a relapse. It was a sedative. A way to numb the fresh sting of humiliation. Outside, a storm was brewing. The Ohio sky had turned a bruised purple gray. Wind rattled the window pane and the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the glass. The storm mirrored the tempest inside me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the cold can sweating in my hand, and listened to the sounds of the house. The low murmur of the television downstairs, the clinking of dishes as my mother cleaned up, the oppressive quiet that followed my father from room to room. Hours passed. The single beer became two. I wasn't drunk, just dull. The sharp edges of my anger and hurt had been sanded down. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown torrent. Rain lashed against the house in sheets and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the old foundation. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. The sound of a car engine, frantic and high-pitched, followed by the sickening crunch of gravel as it sped up our long driveway. It was Chloe's compact sedan. The engine cut out abruptly and a car door slammed shut. I heard her footsteps stumbling and panicked on the porch steps, followed by the frantic jingle of keys and the front door bursting open. I sat up, my senses suddenly on high alert. Something was wrong. Then came the voices from downstairs. They were muffled by the floor and the raging storm, but the emotion was clear. Chloe was sobbing, her words tumbling out in a panicked, hysterical rush. And beneath her cries was the low, rumbling authority of my father's voice. It wasn't comforting. It was controlling. Commanding. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone, the same tone he used when a construction project was going off the rails, the one that meant he was taking charge, fixing a problem no matter the cost. I stood up thinking I should go down, see what was wrong. But I hesitated. What could I do? I was the family problem, not the solution. Inserting myself would only make things worse. He would accuse me of eavesdropping, of meddling. So I waited frozen, listening to the muffled drama unfold below. The crying eventually subsided, replaced by the intense low murmur of my father's voice, insistent and absolute. Finally, exhaustion won. The emotional drain of the evening, combined with the beer and the lulling roar of the storm, pulled me back to my bed. My last conscious thought was one of weary resignation. It was always something with this family, a constant simmering crisis beneath the perfect facade. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the rain wash over me, oblivious to the fact that the real storm had just moved inside. Oblivious to the fact that in the room directly below me, my future was being dismantled, my identity stolen, and my life sacrificed on the altar of my father's twisted love for his perfect daughter. I fell asleep a free man with no idea that I would wake up in chains. Sleep didn't release me gently. It was torn away by a fist of sound and a blast of cold, wet air. One moment I was adrift in the dreamless void brought on by beer and exhaustion. The next, a jarring tremor shook the world around me. A voice amplified and inhuman boomed through the rain-soaked darkness, ordering the occupant of the vehicle to step out with their hands in the air. For a disoriented second, I thought the thunder had learned to speak. Then came the light. A blinding white beam stabbed through the driver's side window, pinning me, forcing my eyes shut. I wasn't in my bed. The soft comfort of my mattress was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding press of a steering wheel against my chest and the unfamiliar angle of a driver's seat. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fog in my head. I tried to push myself up, my hand slipping on something slick and sticky on the steering wheel. The smell of stale beer, rain, and something metallic filled the small space. My car. I was in my old Ford pickup, but I hadn't driven it. I had walked from the lumber mill that afternoon. I remembered every step. How did I get here? The door was wrenched open and the storm, along with 2 uniformed police officers, descended upon me. Rain and wind whipped into the cab. Strong hands grabbed my arms, hauling me out of the truck and onto the wet gravel of our driveway. The world was a chaotic kaleidoscope of flashing red and blue lights, painting streaks across the rain-slicked facade of my childhood home. The home that now looked like a crime scene. Ethan Hayes, one of the officers, shouted over the wind. I could only nod my mind, struggling to catch up with reality. My legs felt weak, unsteady. They held me upright, their grips like iron clamps on my biceps. My gaze darted around, desperately seeking an anchor in the storm of confusion. I saw my truck, its front end crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. The headlight on the passenger side was shattered, a single weeping eye. Yellow police tape was already being unspooled, a flimsy barrier against a nightmare that had already broken through. And then I saw them. Standing on the porch, bathed in the warm golden light spilling from the doorway, were my father and Chloe. My mother stood half hidden behind the door, a silhouette of pure terror. Chloe was wrapped in one of our father's thick jackets, her face pale and tear-streaked. She stared at the ground at her feet, at the swirling rain anywhere but at me. But it was my father's face that stopped my heart. Robert Hayes stood tall, his expression a mask of profound, weary disappointment. He looked at me not with the anger of a father whose son was in trouble, but with the grim finality of a judge who had already passed sentence. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a terrible, calculated sorrow. "What's going on?" I finally managed to stammer, my voice hoarse. "I don't understand." I was in my room. I was asleep. The taller officer, his face grim, gestured with his chin towards the crumpled hood of my truck. He informed me that a vehicle matching this description was reported in a hit and run on Miller Road less than an hour ago. He said a pedestrian was in critical condition. A woman. He told me they found me passed out behind the wheel. The words didn't connect. Hit and run. Critical condition. Passed out. It was a language from a different reality. "No," I said, shaking my head, the motion frantic. "No, that's impossible. I was upstairs. Ask them." I gestured wildly towards the porch, towards my family. "Ask my father." As they pushed my hands behind my back, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into my wrists, a memory surfaced so vivid and out of place it felt like a hallucination. I was 10 years old and Chloe was 4. We were playing in the woods behind the house. She had tripped over a root and gashed her knee open on a sharp rock. I remember the sight of her blood bright red against the dirt and the sound of her terrified screams. I had scooped her up, a skinny 10-year-old carrying his whole world, and ran all the way back to the house, my own tears mixing with hers. I kept telling her it would be okay, that I was there, that I would fix it. When our father saw us, he had looked at me, at the blood on my shirt, and for a fleeting second his eyes held something like pride. I was her protector. The memory vanished as the officer tightened the cuffs. I looked back at the porch, at the little girl I had carried out of the woods, now a woman who couldn't even look at me. The protector was now the accused, and she stood silently by the side of the man who was watching me be condemned. The ride to the Oak Haven police station was a silent, surreal journey. The world outside the rain-streaked windows was a blur of familiar streets turned alien by the flashing lights on the roof. My mind raced, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. I had been in my room. I had a couple of beers. I had fallen asleep. The sequence of events was simple, unbreakable. Yet here I was in the back of a police car, accused of nearly killing someone. It had to be a mistake. A grotesque, horrific mistake. The interrogation room was small, gray, and smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. I sat shivering in my damp clothes while a detective named Miller sat opposite me. He was a man in his 40s with tired eyes that held a deep-seated cynicism. He looked at my file, then at me, and I could see him connecting the dots, my juvenile record, my past struggles with addiction. In his eyes, I wasn't an innocent man caught in a nightmare. I was a ticking time bomb that had finally exploded. He laid out their case with a detached professionalism. He spoke of an anonymous tip about a reckless driver. He mentioned the obvious damage to my truck. He pointed out my disheveled state, the smell of alcohol on my breath. He told me they had found 2 empty beer cans in my room, corroborating their theory that I had been drinking before I decided to go for a drive. And then he delivered the final damning piece of evidence. He told me they had found traces of blood on the steering wheel and my shirt sleeve, which they were sending for analysis. He said it was likely the victim's blood. "I'm telling you, it wasn't me." My voice cracked with desperation. "Someone is setting me up. This makes no sense." Detective Miller just sighed, a weary sound. He'd heard it all before. He leaned forward, his voice low. He advised me that the evidence was overwhelming. He said that with my history, a jury would see a clear picture, a relapsed addict getting drunk, getting behind the wheel, and destroying a life. He told me my best bet was to cooperate, to show remorse. Remorse for what? For a crime I didn't commit, for sleeping in my own bed while someone else hijacked my life. An hour later, the interrogation room door opened. It was my father. My heart leaped with a desperate, foolish surge of hope. He was here. He would clear this up. He would tell them the truth. He would be my alibi. He would fix this. He walked in and the officers left, leaving us alone. He didn't come to my side. He stood by the door, his tall frame filling the space, making the small room feel even more claustrophobic. His face was a mask of stone. "Dad," I croaked, my throat raw. "You have to tell them. Tell them I was home. I was in my room all night." Robert Hayes looked at me, and for the first time I saw no conflict in his eyes. No flicker of doubt or love. Only a cold, hard resolve. He told me he had already spoken with the police. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a business transaction. He said he had told them everything. He told them how I had been distant and moody at dinner. He told them he knew I had been drinking in my room, a clear violation of my recovery. He told them he and my mother had gone to bed early and he had heard my truck start up sometime after 11. He said he had assumed I was just going for a drive to cool off, something I used to do. He told them he never imagined I would do something like this. He finished by saying he was deeply, profoundly ashamed. Every word was a nail being hammered into my coffin. He wasn't describing what happened. He was creating a narrative. He was building a case against his own son. The sounds I heard downstairs, Chloe's hysterical sobs, his commanding voice, it all crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. Chloe, I whispered the name, tasting like ash in my mouth. It was her, wasn't it? She came home. I heard her. She was the one who did this. My father's eyes narrowed into slits of pure ice. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He told me not to dare. He said I would not drag my sister's good name through the mud to save my own worthless skin. He told me Chloe's future was bright, that she was going to be someone, and he would not let me, his greatest failure, destroy that. He said that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the good of the family. Sacrifice. I wasn't his son. I was a sacrifice. A pawn to be removed from the board to protect the queen. The coldness of his betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it burned away my panic, leaving behind a terrifying clarity. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused, his back still to me. He said almost as an afterthought that he had hired a lawyer for me. A public defender would look too suspicious. He was covering every angle. He said the lawyer would advise me to plead guilty, to take whatever deal the prosecutor offered. It would be my one last service to the family. Then he was gone. I was left alone in the gray room, the silence ringing in my ears. The hope I had clung to was gone, ripped away, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. They hadn't just framed me, they had erased me. My father, the architect of our family's life, had just drawn up the blueprints for my destruction, and my sister, the person I once would have died for, had silently handed him the pen. When Detective Miller came back, in his face was set. He told me I was being formally charged with aggravated vehicular assault and leaving the scene of an accident. As he recited my rights, the words were just a distant drone. The real sentence had already been handed down in this very room, not by a judge but by my own father. As the cell door slammed shut, the sound echoed in the empty space where my soul used to be. The fight for my innocence was over before it began. But a new fight, a darker one, was just beginning to stir in the ruins. The first 72 hours in the Oakhaven County Jail were a masterclass in the systematic dismantling of a human being. They take your name and give you a number. They take your clothes and give you a rough, faded orange jumpsuit that smells of industrial bleach and defeat. They take your freedom and give you a 6 by 9 foot concrete box with a steel toilet for a roommate. Every clang of a closing gate, every disembodied shout echoing down the cell block, every moment spent under the flat, indifferent buzz of the fluorescent lights was designed to remind you that you were no longer a person. You were inventory. My despair was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made every breath an effort. I would lie on the thin plastic mattress staring at the gray ceiling, and my mind would become a torture chamber. I saw the face of the woman I had supposedly hit, a stranger whose life was now irrevocably tied to my fabricated crime. I saw Chloe's downcast eyes, a portrait of cowardice. Most of all, I saw my father's face in the interrogation room, cold, resolute, the face of a man who would burn his own son to keep his kingdom warm. The betrayal was a living entity inside me, gnawing at my insides, leaving me hollow. On the third day, they told me my lawyer was here. A sliver of irrational hope pierced the darkness. Maybe my father had reconsidered. Maybe this lawyer was a real one, a fighter who would see the truth. The hope died the moment Arthur Vance walked into the visitation room. He was exactly the kind of lawyer my father would hire, expensive suit-polished shoes, and a smile that never reached his cold reptilian eyes. He carried a sleek leather briefcase that he placed on the table between us with a soft, final thud. He didn't offer condolences or ask for my side of the story. He opened the briefcase and laid out my life like a losing hand of cards. He spoke of my past with a clinical detachment, framing it as an unfortunate but undeniable pattern of behavior. He talked about the mountain of evidence. The DA had the anonymous tip my presence at the scene, the alcohol, the blood. He made it sound like an open and shut case, an inevitability. Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a plea agreement. He explained it in a smooth, practiced tone. He told me that if I pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of reckless endangerment, the DA was willing to be lenient. He said with my cooperation and a show of profound remorse, he could likely get the sentence down to 5 to 7 years with parole possible in 3. He called it a gift. I stared at him, my mind reeling. A gift, I repeated, my voice a dead whisper. I was asleep in my bed. My sister ran someone over. My father framed me to protect her. And you want me to thank you for 3 years in a cage? Arthur Vance's smile tightened. He leaned back, the picture of condescending patience. He told me that was a compelling narrative, but in the real world we deal with evidence, not stories. He said that making such accusations against a respected man like my father and a promising young woman like my sister would only make me look vindictive and unhinged to a jury. It would guarantee the maximum sentence. He wasn't here to find the truth. He was here to manage the fallout. He told me, his voice dropping, that this was what my father wanted. It was the best way to put this unfortunate incident behind the family. That was the moment the weight on my chest transformed. The suffocating despair began to burn, solidifying into something hard and sharp. Rage. A pure, crystalline rage unlike anything I had ever felt. My father didn't just want me in prison. He wanted my compliance. He wanted me to be a willing participant in my own crucifixion. I looked at Arthur Vance, at his expensive tie and his soulless eyes. I told him to take his plea deal and his advice and get the hell out. I told him I wouldn't be signing anything. For the first time, his composure cracked. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He warned me I was making a catastrophic mistake. I replied that the mistake had already been made, but not by me. As he packed his briefcase, he delivered a final parting shot. He said my father had anticipated I might be stubborn. He had instructed Vance to inform me that if I fought this, if I tried to drag Chloe's name into it, he would not only use his full financial and social power to ensure I was buried under the jail, but he would also cut off all support for our mother. He would leave her with nothing. It was a threat of breathtaking cruelty, and it showed me the depths of his depravity. He was willing to sacrifice not 1 but 2 family members to protect his perfect creation. After Vance left, I was taken back to my cell. The rage was a fire in my veins. The threat against my mother, a woman already living as a ghost in her own home, was the final straw. My suffering had reached its apex. I was trapped, checkmated. I couldn't fight in court. I couldn't appeal to their humanity because they had none. They had left me with nothing to lose, and in doing so they had given me a terrible kind of freedom. The freedom of a man who has no reason to play by the rules anymore. Lying on my cot that night, I didn't think about justice. Justice was a fantasy for a different world. I thought about balance. I thought about demolition. My father had built his empire on a foundation of reputation, integrity, and control. He had just used those very tools to destroy me, so I would use them to destroy him. A memory surfaced, one from a miserable summer I spent working for Hayes Construction before I was fired for being late 1 too many times. I remembered the Red Creek Bridge project. It was a small municipal job, but it was lucrative. I remembered overhearing a heated argument between my father and the project foreman. The foreman was protesting the use of a cheaper, lower-grade steel rebar than what was specified in the contract. My father had shouted him down, telling him that what the county inspectors didn't know wouldn't hurt them and that the profit margins were what mattered. The foreman quit a week later. The incident was buried, a small, dirty secret in the foundation of my father's success. The next day, I used my one allotted phone call. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call a friend. I dialed the number for the Oak Haven Chronicle, the local newspaper. I asked for their anonymous tip line and was connected to a voicemail. My heart hammered against my ribs. My voice when I spoke was a low, steady whisper. I didn't give my name. I told them I was a former employee of Hayes Construction with a guilty conscience. I told them the man currently being portrayed as a pillar of the community, Robert Hayes, was a fraud. I told them to look into the Red Creek Bridge project from 6 years ago. I gave them the name of the foreman who quit, Mark Renshaw. I told them to ask him about the grade of steel used in the bridge's support columns. Then I connected it to the present. I told them that a man who would cut corners on public safety to make a profit is the same kind of man who would frame his own son to protect his family's image. I ended the call by saying that the cracks in that bridge were nothing compared to the cracks in the foundation of the Hayes family. The days that followed were an exercise in torturous patience. I was moved from the holding area to the general population, a louder, more dangerous world. I kept to myself the fire of my secret plan, the only thing keeping me warm. I watched the news on the small, grainy television in the common area with a hawk's intensity, my stomach twisting with a mixture of hope and fear. And then it happened. A week after my call, a local news segment came on. The anchor began talking about my case, rehashing the details of the hit and run. My heart sank. But then the story pivoted. The anchor mentioned that in the wake of the Hayes family's legal troubles, their station had received an anonymous tip regarding past business practices at Hayes Construction. The screen cut to a reporter standing in front of the Red Creek Bridge. The name Mark Renshaw, former foreman, was displayed at the bottom of the screen. Renshaw, a grizzled man with honest, angry eyes, was talking to the reporter. He confirmed it all. He spoke of the substandard materials of my father's greed and his dismissal of safety concerns. The report then cut to a shot of my father leaving his office, ambushed by the reporter. He was asked to comment on Renshaw's allegations. Robert Hayes, the man who was always in control, was speechless. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, was twisted into a snarl of pure fury. He shoved the camera away and stormed to his car. Sitting there on a hard plastic chair, surrounded by the noise and despair of the county jail, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. A smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a sharp, cold, predatory thing. The crushing weight on my chest hadn't vanished, but it had lightened. It was as if a portion of my suffering had been transferred, sent out into the world to find its rightful owner. He had built his house on a foundation of lies, and I had just shown everyone the first crack. It was a small victory, a tiny tremor, but I knew it was just the beginning. I was going to bring the whole house down. The news report about the Red Creek Bridge was more than a victory. It was a proof of concept. It confirmed my theory: my father's empire, for all its imposing facade, was vulnerable. His reputation was his center of gravity, and I had just given it a powerful shove. For the first time since my arrest, I felt a flicker of agency. They had put me in a cage, but they had underestimated the reach of a man with nothing left to protect. The rage that had nearly consumed me was now being forged into a weapon, and I was learning how to wield it with precision. My next target was Chloe. If my father was the architect of my ruin, she was the silent, complicit client who had approved the design. Her sin was not of action, but of inaction. Her silence was the mortar holding the bricks of my prison together. To dismantle the structure, I had to chip away at her complicity. I couldn't expose her directly, not yet. That was my trump card, and the timing had to be perfect. For now, I had to attack the very thing my father was trying to protect: her immaculate golden child image and her bright, unblemished future. Medical school. That was her sanctuary, the hallowed ground where she was transforming into the masterpiece of the Hayes family. It was a world built on trust, ethics, and integrity, all the things she had abandoned the night of the accident. I knew from years of hearing her complain and boast that her final year was a pressure cooker of clinical rotations, rigorous exams, and the all-important residency match program. Her entire future hinged on the recommendations of her professors and the pristine nature of her academic record. My mind went to work sifting through memories, searching for a vulnerability. I remembered Chloe's relentless perfectionism, her crippling fear of failure. It led her to study obsessively, but it also on occasion led her to take shortcuts. A few years ago, during a particularly tough semester in her undergraduate pre-med program, I remembered her pulling all-nighters fueled by coffee and something else. She had been cagey about it, but I'd seen the small orange bottles in her trash can. Prescription stimulants, Adderall, not hers. She had been buying them from another student to keep up. It was a minor transgression in the grand scheme of things, but in the hyper-competitive, zero-tolerance world of medical education, it was academic dynamite. The problem was proving it, but I didn't need to prove it to a court of law. I just needed to plant a seed of doubt in the right garden. My public defender, the one my father had hired and whom I now viewed with deep suspicion, was my only conduit to the outside world. His name was Peterson, a younger, less polished version of Arthur Vance. He was clearly out of his depth, tasked with babysitting a client who refused the gift of a plea deal. During our next mandated meeting, I feigned a change of heart. I told him the pressure was getting to me, that maybe he and Vance were right. I saw the relief wash over his face. This was the opening I needed. I told him I was worried about my sister. I painted a picture of a young woman cracking under the strain of my arrest and her demanding studies. I said that I was afraid she was falling back into old habits to cope, When he asked what I meant, I hesitated, playing the part of a protective older brother. Reluctantly, I told him about her past use of unprescribed stimulants. I gave him the name of the university, the approximate dates, and even the name of the student I suspected had sold them to her, something I'd overheard during a heated phone call she thought no one was listening to. I then made my request. I told Peterson that I couldn't bear the thought of Chloe destroying her future. I asked him as a personal favor if his investigator could just discreetly look into it. Not to accuse her, I insisted, but to make sure she was okay. I framed it as an act of familial concern, the last desperate attempt of a lost brother to protect his sister. He was skeptical, but my apparent cooperation on the plea deal made him more pliable. He saw it as a harmless request that would keep his difficult client happy. He agreed to make a few informal inquiries. I knew exactly what would happen. An investigator, even one making informal inquiries on behalf of a law office, asking questions about academic misconduct and prescription drug abuse at a prestigious medical school, would be like dropping a lit match into a room full of gasoline. The questions wouldn't need to lead to formal charges. The mere existence of the inquiry would be enough. It would trigger alarms, create whispers, and attach a cloud of suspicion to Chloe's name that would be impossible to wash away. Her professors, the ones writing her letters of recommendation, would hear about it. The residency review board would hear about it. While that slow-burning fuse was lit, I turned my attention back to my father. The bridge story had damaged his public image, but I needed to hit him where he was truly vulnerable: his finances. Hayes Construction was his identity. Its success was the metric by which he measured his own worth. Again, I dove into my memory back to that miserable summer working for him. I was a glorified gopher, which meant I saw and heard everything. I remembered the frantic energy around the end of the fiscal quarter. I remembered his bookkeeper, a nervous, perpetually sweating man named Gerald, working late into the night. I recalled hushed, tense conversations about creative accounting and reallocating project costs to make the quarterly earnings look better for the bank and potential investors. At the time, it was just business jargon I didn't understand. Now it sounded a lot like fraud. The key was Gerald. He was a timid man, terrified of my father's temper. He would never speak out willingly. I needed to force his hand. My next phone call was not to the newspaper. It was to the IRS. I used the same anonymous concerned citizen persona. This time, I identified myself as a distressed mid-level employee at Hayes Construction. I didn't claim to have definitive proof, as that would sound suspicious. Instead, I expressed deep, manufactured concern about irregularities I had noticed in the company's books, specifically regarding the reporting of material costs versus labor expenses on several large, recently completed projects. I mentioned Gerald by name, not as a co-conspirator, but as the bookkeeper who seemed overly stressed and was being pressured by my father to make the numbers work. I was careful to sound like an accountant, using just enough of the right terminology I'd picked up from listening to my father's business calls. Finally, I delivered the masterstroke. I told the agent that the reason I was calling now was that I had recently overheard Mr. Hayes bragging about a large, undocumented cash transaction related to a private residential project. This, I knew, was the kind of bait the IRS couldn't resist. The threat of untaxed cash income would trigger an immediate and thorough audit. An audit is not a news report, it's a financial colonoscopy. It would paralyze the company, freeze its assets, and put every single transaction, every invoice, and every secret deal under a microscope. Gerald, faced with the choice between loyalty to my father and federal prison, would fold like a cheap suit. The weeks that followed were a quiet, brutal war of attrition. I settled into the grim rhythm of jail life, my mind a command center miles away from my physical body. I deflected Peterson's questions about the plea deal, telling him I needed more time, buying every day I could. The first report from the front lines came via a hushed conversation I overheard between two guards. They were talking about Robert Hayes, the local big shot. One of them mentioned his wife had heard from a friend at the bank that federal agents had spent the entire day at the Hayes Construction offices. They had seized boxes of financial records. My heart beat a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. The audit was underway. The financial squeeze had begun. The second report came from Peterson himself, and it was far more satisfying. He arrived for our meeting looking flustered. He told me his investigators' discreet inquiries had caused an unexpected stir at the medical school. The dean of student affairs had been alerted. Chloe had been called into a meeting to discuss serious allegations regarding her academic history. Her name had been flagged by the National Residency Matching Program pending an internal review. Peterson looked at me, a new suspicion dawning in his eyes. He said Chloe had vehemently denied everything, but the damage was done. The rumor mill was in overdrive. Her perfect record was now permanently stained with a question mark. He asked me directly if this was what I had intended. I looked back at him, my face a mask of weary innocence. I told him I was horrified. I said I had only been trying to help her. But inside, the cold, satisfying smile had returned. I had taken her greatest strength, her flawless reputation, and turned it into a source of suspicion and shame. I had forced my father into a two-front war. His business was under financial siege, and his precious daughter's future was in jeopardy. He was a builder, a man who constructed things to last. But I was learning the art of demolition. And I knew that to bring down a structure, you don't start with the walls. You start by shattering the windows and poisoning the well, making the inhabitants feel unsafe, exposed, and paranoid. You attack their most prized assets and turn their sanctuaries into places of fear. The foundation was still standing, but it was riddled with cracks, and I was just getting started. In the controlled monotony of jail, you learn to read the world through ripples. You can't see the stone being thrown, but you can feel the vibrations it sends through the water. The first ripple reached me in the form of my mother. It had been weeks since my arrest, and this was the first time she had come to see me. When she walked into the visitation room and sat down behind the thick, scratched plexiglass, she was a stranger. My mother, Eleanor Hayes, had always been a quiet presence, a woman who moved through life like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, her colors muted and bleeding into the background. But the woman who sat before me now was faded to almost nothing. Her eyes, the same ones I had inherited, were hollowed out, swimming in a grief so profound it seemed to have physically aged her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the receiver. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me, her expression a silent scream. When she finally found her voice, it was a dry, rustling whisper. She told me the house was no longer a home. It was a tomb, she said, haunted by the ghosts of what they had done. She spoke of my father, and the portrait she painted was not of a powerful tyrant, but of a caged animal. He was a man unraveling. The IRS audit had been a devastating blow, not just to his finances, but to his very core. Robert Hayes was a man who commanded, who controlled, who dictated reality. Now his days were consumed by frantic calls with lawyers and accountants, his nights spent pacing the floor of his study, surrounded by boxes of financial records that had become his accusers. The local bank, smelling blood in the water, had frozen his line of credit. 2 major projects were stalled. His employees, men who had once looked at him with a mixture of fear and respect, now whispered behind his back. The foundation of his identity, the infallible, untouchable patriarch, was crumbling, and he was descending into a maelstrom of paranoia and rage. She told me he would erupt without warning, shouting about betrayal, about enemies hiding in the shadows. But the worst part, she whispered, was the silence. Long, heavy hours where he would just sit in his leather chair, staring at the wall, his face a mask of gray stone. The architect was trapped in a collapsing building of his own design, and he couldn't find a way out. Then she spoke of Chloe. The pride of the Hayes family was broken. The unexpected stir at the medical school had become a full-blown inferno. The internal review, while unable to prove past misconduct, had left an indelible mark. Her residency applications, once a source of confident expectation, were now a source of daily terror. She had been waitlisted at her top choices and rejected outright by others. The whispers followed her down the sterile hospital corridors, the questioning glances from professors and peers feeling like physical blows. My mother described finding Chloe sobbing in her room, surrounded by medical textbooks she could no longer bring herself to open. The bright future my father had sacrificed me for was flickering, threatening to go out. The golden child had discovered that her shine was not inherent. It was a fragile veneer, and now it was tarnished beyond repair. She had started having panic attacks. She wasn't sleeping. She had lost weight. The guilt which she had successfully suppressed under the weight of her ambition was now consuming her. She had gotten what she wanted, her freedom, at the cost of mine, but the prize had turned to ash in her hands. My mother told me Chloe had started talking about the accident in her sleep, mumbling apologies to a stranger and to me. She lived in constant fear that the truth would come out, not from me but from her own fracturing mind. The silence they had bought with my life was now deafening her. As my mother spoke, a strange and terrible thing happened within me. I had fantasized about this moment, imagined their suffering with a vindictive glee. I had wanted them to feel a fraction of the agony they had inflicted upon me. And now they were. The reports from the outside world were confirming the success of my campaign. Yet the satisfaction I expected was hollow. It was cold and thin like winter sunlight. Listening to my mother describe the wreckage of our family didn't feel like victory. It felt like reading the casualty report from a war I had started. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. She asked me if I knew anything about what was happening about the IRS, about the rumors at the school. It was the question I had been waiting for. I could have confessed, could have claimed my victory, and watched the impact on her face. But looking at her, this broken woman who was a victim in her own right, I couldn't do it. I simply shook my head and told her I was just as confused as she was. It was a lie, another brick in the wall between us, but it felt like a mercy. Our time was up. As she stood to leave, she pressed her trembling hand against the glass. She told me she was sorry. For everything. It was the first time she had acknowledged the truth, even implicitly. And in her eyes I saw the source of her deepest pain. She was trapped between a monstrous husband and a wronged son, and her inaction had made her complicit in the destruction of both. After she left, I was led back to my cell. The cold satisfaction I'd felt after each successful strike was gone, replaced by a profound and chilling emptiness. I had set out to make them suffer, and I had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. I had wanted to hear the sound of their world shattering, and the echoes of it were now reaching me even in here. I had proven they were not untouchable. I had proven that their carefully constructed reality could be dismantled piece by piece from a jail cell. I had watched from a distance as the patriarch became a paranoid wreck and the golden child became a walking ghost. They were deadlocked in a silent, suffocating hell of their own making. They were stunned, broken, and utterly shocked that their perfect plan had backfired so spectacularly. I had achieved my goal. So why did I feel so empty? I lay on my cot, the sounds of the jail fading into a dull roar. The rage that had been my fuel was burning low. I had engineered their downfall, but it hadn't brought me peace. It hadn't erased the betrayal. It had only created more wreckage, more pain. I had thought that revenge would be a destination, a place of satisfaction and release. I was beginning to realize it was just another kind of prison. The question was no longer how I could make them hurt more. The question, the one that now haunted my waking moments, was what I was supposed to build from all this ash. The end didn't come with a dramatic courtroom confession or a triumphant exoneration. It came quietly, like the settling of dust after a demolition. The final piece of the structure to fall was Chloe. Her fractured mind, worn down by guilt and the relentless pressure of my invisible campaign, finally gave way. It was Peterson who told me. He came for a visit, but this time he didn't bring a plea deal or questions. He just sat down, looking tired and much older than his years, and relayed the story. Chloe had walked into the Oak Haven police station 2 days prior, accompanied by her own lawyer, not one of my father's expensive bulldogs, but a young, earnest woman from a legal aid clinic. She had given Detective Miller a full signed confession. She told them everything: the fight with her boyfriend, the rain-slicked road, the sickening thud of impact, the blind panic. She detailed her hysterical return home and the cold, calculating decision made by our father. She described how he had carried me from my bed, his own son, an unconscious prop in his stage-managed play, and placed me in the driver's seat. She confessed how he had coached her, drilled into her the story she was to tell, the silence she was to keep. Her confession was a meticulous and devastating account of the conspiracy, leaving no room for doubt. The gears of justice, which had ground me down so efficiently, began to turn in the opposite direction. My father was arrested at his office. There was no struggle. Peterson said the news reports described him as a man already defeated, a hollowed-out version of his former self. He was charged with a litany of crimes: orchestrating a false report, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. The IRS audit, my anonymous tip now corroborated by his obvious desperation, had already crippled his business. This arrest was the final fatal blow. Hayes Construction, the monument to his name, was effectively dead. I was released 24 hours later. The process was a sterile, bureaucratic affair. They handed me my old clothes in a plastic bag, returned my wallet, and pointed me toward the door. I walked out of the Oak Haven County Jail and into the bright, overwhelming light of a late autumn afternoon. The air was crisp and clean. Freedom didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a dislocation, like a deep-sea diver surfacing too quickly. The world was too loud, too bright, too fast. I didn't go home. There was no home to go to. That house was just a building now, a crime scene tainted by betrayal. I got a room at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people go when they have nowhere else to be. For the first few days, I did nothing. I sat in the dim, quiet room and let the silence seep into me, a balm on the raw noise of the past few months. The trial, when it happened, was a formality. Chloe, as the primary witness for the prosecution, pleaded guilty to the original hit and run. Due to her confession and cooperation, she received a suspended sentence, community service, and a permanent mark on her record that would almost certainly end her medical career before it began. She had sacrificed her future, after all, just not in the way our father had intended. My father, defiant to the end, pleaded not guilty. His trial was short. The evidence anchored by Chloe's testimony was irrefutable. He was found guilty and sentenced to several years in a state penitentiary. The great Robert Hayes, the builder of bridges and legacies, would spend his final productive years in a cell not much different from the one he had sent me to. I attended every day of his trial, sitting silently in the back of the courtroom. I wasn't there for vengeance. I was there as an observer, a student of my own tragedy. I watched him, this man who had been a god in my small world, shrink on the witness stand. He was no longer a titan, just a bitter, frightened old man who had loved his idea of perfection more than he had ever loved his children. He had tried to build a perfect house, but the foundation was rotten and he ended up buried in the rubble. One afternoon, months after it was all over, Chloe found me. I was working a simple job at a landscaping company, finding a strange peace in the mindless physical labor of creation rather than destruction. She approached me as I was loading equipment into a truck. She looked thin and tired, but the frantic, haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, settled sadness. She didn't offer excuses. She just stood there, the silence stretching between us, and told me she was sorry. She said it wasn't enough that the word was too small for the chasm between us, but it was all she had. She told me she had lived every day in a prison of her own making, and that confessing had been the only way to find the key. She was working now as a paralegal, she said, trying to help people who couldn't afford a proper defense. It wasn't penance. It was just a path, a way to move forward. I listened to her, and I felt the last embers of my rage cool into something else. Not forgiveness, I don't know if I'll ever get there, but a kind of understanding. I saw her not as a monster, but as a weak person who had made a monstrous choice under the influence of a powerful, toxic love. I told her that what our father had done was to build cages for both of us. Hers was gilded, comfortable, and adorned with praise, while mine was cold, bare, and made of shame. But they were cages all the same. The night of the accident, she had simply chosen to lock my door so she could stay in hers. The lesson, I said, the one that had cost us everything, was that a gilded cage is still a cage. Freedom isn't about being protected from the world. It's about facing the consequences of your place in it. We stood there for a moment longer, two strangers who shared the same blood and the same ruins. Then she turned and walked away. There were no promises to stay in touch, no false hopes of reconciliation. Our family was a story that had ended. I learned many things in that dark chapter of my life. I learned that revenge can be a powerful motivator, a precise and effective tool. But it's a tool of demolition, not construction. It can raze a city to the ground, but it can't build a single home. It offers the cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger, but it leaves your own soul empty. My real freedom didn't come when the jail door opened. It came later, slowly, in the quiet moments of an ordinary life. It came with the realization that I was no longer living in reaction to my father's judgment or my sister's betrayal. Their actions had defined me, imprisoned me, and then paradoxically liberated me. By taking everything from me, they had forced me to find out what, if anything, was left. And what was left was just me, Ethan, a man who had survived the fire. A man standing in the ashes, finally free to build something of his own.